The Ironhead Tavern sat like a scar on the edge of town, a low-slung brick building with blacked-out windows and a neon sign that had been flickering since 1987. Inside, the air hung thick with cigarette smoke and the ghost of 1,000 spilled beers, a haze that softened the edges of everything except the people. Chrome glinted from every corner, belt buckles, bike keys hanging from belt loops, the studs on leather vests worn soft as skin from years of highway wind. The jukebox in the corner growled out Old Steppenwolf, barely audible over the rumble of conversation and the periodic crack of pool balls connecting. This was hallowed ground, a temple built for motor oil and bad decisions, where the only law that mattered was the one written across the backs of the men who drank there. It was Thursday night, which meant it was quiet by Ironhead standards. Maybe 20 bikers scattered throughout the bar, sitting in tight clusters around scarred wooden tables or leaning against the bar itself, which had been carved into by generations of knives and keys. The bartender, a woman named Jolene with arms like bridge cables and a face that had seen too much to be impressed by anything, moved behind the bar with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing this since before most of these boys could grow their first beard. She poured whiskey and beer without being asked, knew who drank what, and kept a Louisville Slugger under the register that she'd only had to use twice. The warm glow of Edison bulbs strung along the ceiling cast everything in amber, making the smoke drift like spirits through a graveyard. Tommy, Hammer, Braddock sat alone at his usual table in the back corner, positioned so he could see both doors and the bar. He was a mountain of a man, 6'4" and built like a bear that had spent time in prison, with a shaved head that gleamed in the low light and a beard that reached halfway down his chest, shot through with gray that he'd earned the hard way. His vest, his colors, carried the winged death's head and the red and white that meant everything in his world. 47 years old, and he'd been wearing those colors for 26 of them. 3 scars across his knuckles told stories he didn't need to repeat. He sat with his back against the wall, one boot up on the chair across from him, working on his 4th beer of the night, and watching everything without appearing to watch anything at all. If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The story unfolding in the Ironhead that night was the kind that would get told in whispers for years, the kind that reminded everyone why certain lines should never be crossed. Hammer took a long pull from his bottle, feeling the cold liquid cut through the smoke in his throat, and let his gaze drift across the familiar landscape of his brothers. There was Diesel at the bar, laughing at something Jolene had said, his gap-toothed grin visible even from across the room. Snake and Crow were locked in a game of pool that had been going for an hour, neither one willing to lose, because neither one ever did. The prospect, a kid they called Mouse who was desperate to earn his patch, wiped down tables with the kind of intensity that came from knowing he was being evaluated on everything, even the things that didn't seem to matter. The door swung open, bringing with it a gust of October wind that made the smoke swirl and the lights dance. A woman walked in, and the temperature in the room changed in ways that had nothing to do with the weather. She was maybe 35, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that swung like a pendulum as she moved, wearing jeans that had earned there were honestly in a leather jacket that fit her like it had been made specifically for her frame. Sarah. She'd been coming to the Ironhead for 3 years now, ever since her brother Grizz had brought her around, and she'd proven herself the kind of woman who could drink with bikers without it being a thing, who understood the culture without trying to become part of it. She wasn't property, and she wasn't a hang-around. She was family in the way that mattered most. She could be trusted. She made her way to the bar, and Jolene had a Jack and Coke waiting before Sarah even sat down. They exchanged words that Hammer couldn't hear, but he saw Sarah laugh, saw the way her shoulders relaxed as she settled into the familiar environment. This was her place too, earned through respect and reinforced through the kind of loyalty that couldn't be faked. Grizz was up in Oregon handling club business, and everyone knew that Sarah was under the protection of the club while he was gone. Not that she needed it, really. She could handle herself. But that was the thing about family. You protected them whether they needed it or not. The trouble walked in 20 minutes later. 5 guys, mid-20s to early 30s, wearing the kind of clothes that cost too much and meant too little. Designer jeans and leather jackets bought off a rack somewhere in a mall. worn because they thought it made them look dangerous. They had the swagger of men who'd never actually been tested, who'd grown up in suburbs where the worst thing that ever happened was a failed drug test or a DUI that daddy's lawyer made disappear. Hammer cataloged them without moving his head, without even appearing to pay attention. The tallest one had a gold chain that caught the light. Another one wore sunglasses indoors like an asshole. They were loud immediately, their voices carrying the artificial volume of men who needed everyone to know they were there. Jolene served them because that was her job, but Hammer saw the way her jaw tightened, saw the microscopic shake of her head. These weren't regulars. These weren't even occasional. These were tourists who'd wandered into the wrong church and didn't have the sense to keep their voices down and their hands to themselves. They ordered craft beers that the Ironhead didn't carry, then settled for bottles they held by the neck like props in a movie about people they'd never actually be. They clustered near the bar, too close to Sarah's space, and Hammer felt something in his chest tighten like a wrench turning a bolt. The conversation in the bar continued around them, because this was still neutral ground and everyone was still being civil. But Hammer noticed that Diesel had shifted his position slightly, that Snake had stopped chalking his cue, that every single man wearing colors had made the same subtle adjustment and posture that said they were aware, they were watching, they were ready. The prospects learned that instinct or they didn't become members. The members lived by it or they didn't live long. It was the one in the sunglasses who said it. Hammer didn't hear the exact words, but he didn't need to. He saw the way Sarah's back stiffened, saw the way her hand tightened around her glass. He saw the way the 5 men laughed, the kind of laughter that came from cruelty masquerading as humor. And he saw the one in the sunglasses lean in toward Sarah and say something else, something that made his friends laugh even harder. The words themselves didn't matter. The tone did. The intent did. The fundamental fucking disrespect of it did. The bar didn't go quiet. That would be too obvious, too cinematic. But the quality of the noise changed. Conversations continued, but with a new undertone, a new awareness. Every man wearing colors knew what was about to happen, even if the 5 idiots at the bar hadn't figured it out yet. This was the moment when territory got defended, when lines got drawn, when the consequences of stupidity became very real and very immediate. Hammer set his beer down on the table with a sound like a judge's gavel. He stood up slowly, unfurling his considerable frame from the chair with the deliberate quality of a man who had all the time in the world because he knew no one was going anywhere. The chair scraped against the floor, wood against wood, and that sound carried. Conversations didn't stop, but they faltered, words trailing off mid-sentence as heads turned. He was 6'4" and 260 pounds of scarred knuckles and bad intentions, and when he stood up, it was like watching a mountain decide to move. His colors hung from his shoulders with the weight of history, with the authority of blood and brotherhood, and every patch and pin told a story that these 5 boys couldn't begin to understand. He picked his beer back up, the bottle small in his massive hand, and started walking toward the bar. His boots hit the floor with steady, measured impacts, each step deliberate, each step carrying the promise of what came next. The smoke seemed to part around him. The lights seemed to dim everywhere except where he was walking. Every eye in the bar tracked his movement, because everyone knew. Everyone except the 5 men who were still laughing, who were still talking, who were still fundamentally unaware that they just made the last mistake they'd make in the Ironhead Tavern. Hammer walked slowly, in no hurry at all, because hurrying was what you did when you were uncertain. He was a lot of things, but uncertain had never been one of them. Block 2. The one in the sunglasses finally noticed him when Hammer was 3 steps away, and something in the kid's lizard brain must have fired a warning because his smile faltered and died like a candle in the wind. He turned, still holding his beer, still wearing those ridiculous sunglasses in a dark bar, and found himself looking at a wall of leather and muscle and barely restrained violence that had been walking the earth since before he was born. The other 4 turned too, their laughter trickling away into uncertain silence. And Hammer watched the moment they realized they'd fucked up. It was always the same moment. The eyes widened slightly. The shoulders tensed. The brain started doing calculations about exits and distances and whether an apology would be enough to make this go away. It wouldn't be. Hammer stopped directly in front of them, close enough that they had to look up to meet his eyes, close enough that they could smell the leather and the beer in the road on him. He didn't say anything. Didn't need to. He just stood there, holding his beer, looking at them with the kind of calm that was more terrifying than any amount of rage could ever be. Behind him, he heard the subtle sounds of his brothers moving into position. Diesel had slid off his bar stool. Snake had set down his pool cue. Crow was walking slowly across the floor. They were forming a semicircle without being asked, without needing discussion, because this was what family did. This was what brothers did. "Hey man, we're just," the one in the sunglasses started, but Hammer cut him off with a slight shake of his head. "Take them off," Hammer said. His voice was quiet, barely above a whisper, but it carried in the space between them like thunder rolling across distant hills. "What?" "The sunglasses. Take them off when you're talking to me." The kid's hands shook slightly as he pulled the sunglasses off and hooked them on his collar. Without them, he looked younger, more scared, more aware of exactly how badly this could go. His eyes darted to his friends, looking for support or courage or an escape route, but they were all frozen, all suddenly very aware that they were 5 against 20, and the 20 had home field advantage and the kind of experience that came from violence being a lifestyle choice rather than something you watched in movies. "What did you say to her?" Hammer asked, still in that quiet voice, still holding his beer like they were just having a casual conversation. "It was just a joke, man. We didn't mean." "What did you say?" The kid swallowed hard enough that Hammer could see his Adam's apple bob. I said she looked good. That's all. Just a compliment." Hammer's eyes shifted slightly, found Sarah sitting at the bar. She was watching now, her drink forgotten, and he could see the anger in her face mixing with something else. Not fear. Never fear. Sarah didn't scare easy. But there was a wariness there, a tension that came from knowing that men like these 5 saw women like her as objects instead of people, as things to be commented on and grabbed at and diminished. He looked back at the kid in front of him. "You know who that is?" Hammer asked. "No, man, I don't." "That's Sarah. She's Grizz's little sister. Grizz is the sergeant-at-arms for this chapter. You know what that means." The kid shook his head, but Hammer could see in his eyes that he was starting to understand, starting to piece together that he hadn't just insulted some random woman in some random bar. He'd insulted family. He'd insulted a sister of the club in the club's own house, and that was the kind of mistake that had consequences. "It means," Hammer continued, his voice still quiet, still calm, "that she's under our protection. It means that when you disrespect her, you disrespect every man wearing these colors. It means that your little joke just became my business." Behind the 5 men, the door to the bar opened, and 2 more bikers walked in, saw the tableau, and immediately understood. They moved to the door and stood there, arms crossed, making it clear that nobody was leaving until this was settled. The 5 men were well and truly trapped now, surrounded by leather and denim, and the kind of men who'd forgotten more about violence than these boys would ever learn. "Look, we're sorry, okay," one of the others said, finding his voice. "We didn't know. We'll just go. It won't happen again." Hammer took a long, slow drink from his beer, draining half the bottle, and then lowered it. "You will go," he said, "but not yet. First, you're going to apologize to Sarah. You're going to mean it. And then you're going to walk out of here, and you're never going to come back. This bar is off limits to you. This whole block is off limits to you. You see a Hell's Angel anywhere, you cross the street. Are we clear?" The 5 of them nodded like bobblehead dolls, falling over themselves to agree. They turned towards Sarah, and the one who'd made the original comment opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Sarah held up her hand. "Don't," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I don't want your apology. I don't want anything from you except for you to understand that women don't exist for your entertainment. We're not decoration. We're not opportunities for you to prove how clever you think you are to your friends." She stood up from her bar stool, and even though she was a foot shorter than most of the men in the room, she carried herself with the kind of authority that made size irrelevant. "You came into this bar thinking you own the place. You don't. You came in thinking you could say whatever you wanted. You can't. And you came in thinking there wouldn't be consequences. You were wrong about that too." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the jukebox seemed to have paused between songs. Hammer watched Sarah, felt a surge of respect for her that went beyond the fact that she was Grizz's sister, beyond the fact that she was family. She was standing up for herself, making them understand not just that they'd violated territory, but that they'd violated her humanity. That mattered more than any beating Hammer could deliver. Now apologize to Jolene for wasting her time, Sarah continued. Pay your tab with a 50% tip and get the fuck out of here before my friends decide that words aren't enough. They couldn't move fast enough. Bills came out of wallets. Apologies tumbled out of mouths. And within 90 seconds, they were heading toward the door. The two bikers standing guard stepped aside, just enough to let them through single file, and Hammer watched them practically run to their car in the parking lot. The engine started and tires squealed as they pulled out onto the street, disappearing into the October night like they'd never been there at all. The bar was quiet for a moment longer, and then Jolene reached under the bar and came up with a bottle of top-shelf whiskey that she only brought out for special occasions. "That was beautiful," she said to Sarah, pouring 3 fingers into a clean glass. On the house, the tension broke like a fever. Conversations resumed. The jukebox kicked back in with some old Johnny Cash. Snake and Crow returned to their pool game. Diesel climbed back onto his bar stool and picked up whatever story he'd been telling before the interruption. The Ironhead Tavern returned to being exactly what it had always been, a sanctuary for people who understood that respect was earned and boundaries were sacred and family meant something more than just blood. Hammer walked back to his table but didn't sit down. He stood there for a moment, looking at Sarah, and she raised her glass to him in a small salute. He nodded back, a gesture of understanding between two people who knew that sometimes the threat of violence was enough, that sometimes the demonstration of solidarity and strength prevented bloodshed rather than caused it. That was the thing about respect, real respect, earned respect. It meant knowing when to fight and when the fight was already won. Mouse, the prospect, appeared at Hammer's elbow with a fresh beer, cold and dripping condensation. "Thought you might need this, brother," he said, and Hammer took it with a nod of thanks. The kid was learning, understanding that club business wasn't always about throwing punches. Sometimes it was about standing up. Sometimes it was about making it clear that certain things wouldn't be tolerated. Sometimes it was about protecting the people who mattered. Hammer sat back down in his corner, in his usual spot, and resumed his vigil over the bar. Outside, the October wind pushed leaves across the parking lot, and the neon sign flickered and the world kept turning. Inside the Ironhead Tavern, the people who belonged there went about their business, secure in the knowledge that this was their place, their home, and that they looked out for each other in ways that went deeper than most people would ever understand. Sarah caught his eye from across the room and mouthed 2 words, "Thank you." Hammer raised his beer slightly in acknowledgement, then took a drink and let himself smile, just a little, just enough. The night was still young. The beer was cold. His brothers were around him. And somewhere up in Oregon, when Grizz called to check in like he did every night, Jolene would tell him what happened and Grizz would know that his sister had been protected, that his family had stood up, that the code they all lived by was still worth something. That was what it meant to wear the colors. That was what it meant to be a Hell's Angel. Not the violence, though violence was sometimes necessary. Not the bikes, or the leather, or the reputation. It was the understanding that some things were sacred. Some people were worth protecting. Some lines could never be crossed. Hammer finished his beer and set the empty bottle on the table. Tomorrow the sun would rise, and the world would keep spinning, and those 5 idiots would tell their friend about the night they almost got killed in a biker bar. But they'd leave out the part about what they'd done to deserve it. They always did, and that was fine. The people who mattered knew the truth. The people who mattered understood. The Ironhead Tavern sat like a scar on the edge of town, and inside its walls, the people who belonged there drank their beer and told their stories and looked after each other the way family always had, the way family always would.